The static was a whisper from a dead world. On November 15, 2013, inside a sterile dorm room at Johns Hopkins University, 21-year-old Ethan Hayes was listening to nothing. His computer screen glowed, lines of code scrolling past as his custom-built software swept the abandoned radio frequencies, the digital graveyards of the airwaves. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. This was a test, a digital exercise to prove his program could sift through decades of electromagnetic silence. The hum of his laptop's fan was the only sound in the room, a monotonous drone accompanying the silent hunt. For hours, there was only the hiss of empty space, the sound of forgotten conversations long since faded into the cosmos. Then, a flicker, a ghost in the machine. It was a barely audible pattern, buried beneath 24 years of decay, a loop, no longer than 20 seconds, caught in some strange, ethereal echo chamber of the spectrum. Ethan's software flagged it as a persistent anomaly. He isolated the frequency, rerouting the signal through a series of digital filters he'd designed himself. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to peel back the layers of noise. The static softened, giving way to a faint, rhythmic cadence. It wasn't an instrument or a signal beacon. It was a voice, a man's voice, laced with an urgency that time had failed to erase. It was panicked, desperate, and it was repeating a string of characters over and over again. License plate XJY 502. Ethan ripped the headphones from his ears, his heart pounding against his ribs. The silence of his room felt heavy, suddenly violated. He stared at the waveform on his screen, a jagged, pulsing line that represented a human voice trapped in a digital amber. His logical mind, the mind of a computer science student, tried to rationalize it. A signal bleed from a nearby broadcast? A prankster hijacking an old frequency? But the raw, unfiltered terror in the recording felt too authentic. It was the sound of a man's last breath, a final, desperate attempt to send a message to anyone who might be listening. He clicked play again, the ghostly voice filling his ears once more, a chilling plea from a time before he was even born. The date was October 12, 1989. In a wood-paneled basement in a quiet suburb of Baltimore, the air smelled of warm electronics and solder. This was the sanctuary of Frank Miller, a 45-year-old ham radio operator. His station wasn't a sterile collection of monitors and processors like Ethan's. It was an analog kingdom of glowing vacuum tubes, heavy steel transceivers, and wires that snaked across the floor like vines. A map of the world, dotted with colored pins marking his contacts, covered one wall. For Frank, this room was a portal, a way for an ordinary man to connect with the globe from the comfort of his home. Tonight was like any other, a calm evening spent turning the large, weighted VFO knob, listening to the symphony of the airwaves. Frank was a man of routine and quiet passion. A father of one, a loving husband, and an employee at a local electronics firm, he found his escape not in sports or television, but in the crackle and pop of shortwave radio. He knew the bands like the back of his hand, could identify the origin of a signal just by its faint, characteristic warble. He wasn't a spy or an adventurer. He was a hobbyist, a member of a global community connected by copper wire and curiosity. He settled into his worn leather chair, adjusted his heavy headphones, and began his nightly ritual of scanning the frequencies, searching for a friendly voice in the dark, completely unaware that he was about to tune in to his own demise. His fingers danced across the controls, gliding past the usual chatter of fellow operators discussing weather patterns and antenna configurations. Then he found it. A signal on a frequency that was supposed to be quiet. It was a coded transmission, clipped and professional, the voices on the other end speaking in short, cryptic bursts. It wasn't the friendly banter of the ham radio community. This was different. This was cold, calculated, and secretive. Frank's curiosity, the very trait that defined him as an operator, took over. He leaned closer, his brow furrowed in concentration, and began to scribble notes on a pad next to his rig, trying to decipher the strange language of the intruders who had trespassed on his airwaves. The pieces began to click into place with terrifying clarity. Words like Port of Baltimore, shipment, and containment cut through the coded jargon. Frank wasn't a fool. He knew what he was hearing was not a legitimate business transaction. He had stumbled upon something he was never meant to hear, a conversation about a major drug shipment happening right in his city. The thrill of discovery was instantly replaced by a cold, creeping dread that started in the pit of his stomach. He was no longer just a listener, he was a witness. In the cozy safety of his basement, surrounded by the tools of his beloved hobby, Frank Miller realized he had just made a fatal mistake. Then, a sound from above. The distinct thud of a car door slamming shut on the quiet suburban street outside his home. It was too late, too deliberate. They weren't just broadcasting, they were close. The hair on his arm stood on end as the muffled sound of footsteps echoed on the floorboards above him. Panic seized him. His sanctuary had become a trap. His eyes darted around the room, landing on his microphone. He had seconds, maybe less. With a trembling hand, he keyed the mic, his mind racing to broadcast the only piece of information that could link these men to their crime. He spoke with the last of his courage, his voice a frantic whisper, describing the men, their car, and the license plate. Back in 2013, Ethan Hayes sat frozen, the 20-second loop playing on. He was listening to the final testimony of Frank Miller, a voice that had been screaming into the void for 24 years. The transmission ended abruptly, not with a sign-off, but with a choked gasp and the sound of a struggle, followed by an eternity of static. On the night of October 12, 1989, Frank Miller vanished without a trace, his case eventually going cold, filed away as a man who simply abandoned his family. But his voice hadn't vanished. It had traveled through time, a digital ghost waiting for someone with the right technology to hear its story. And Ethan had just answered the call. The sound cut out, but the silence that followed was louder than any static. Ethan Hayes felt a cold sweat trace a path down his spine, the cheap fabric of his university hoodie suddenly feeling clammy and suffocating. His heart hammered against his ribcage, a frantic drumbeat in the otherwise quiet dorm room. He stared at the glowing waveform on his monitor, a digital ghost that had just whispered a 24-year-old secret directly into his ears. It wasn't just a voice. It was the sonic imprint of a man's final, desperate moments. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the weight of that long, dead panic, and Ethan felt an unnerving sense that he was no longer alone. The ghost wasn't just in the machine anymore. It was in the room with him. His mind, trained in logic and code, scrambled for a rational explanation. It had to be a prank, a cleverly edited piece of audio uploaded by some internet troll to an obscure frequency. Or perhaps it was a signal bleed, a fragment of an old movie, or a radio drama that had somehow become trapped in an atmospheric echo. He hit play again, listening with a critical ear, trying to find the flaw, the telltale sign of artifice. But there was none. The raw, unscripted terror in the voice was undeniable. The slight waver, the hitch in the breath before the license plate was repeated. It was the sound of genuine fear, a sound that no actor could perfectly replicate because it was born from the certainty of impending death. The words echoed in his mind, indelible, license plate XJY502. It was a single, concrete piece of information in a sea of spectral noise. This detail anchored the disembodied voice to the real world. A license plate belongs to a car belongs to a person, and that person, according to the desperate tone of the broadcast, was a killer. The mystery deepened with every loop of the recording. Who was this man with the terrified voice? Who was he trying to warn? And what happened in the moments after the transmission was so violently cut short? The questions began to swarm Ethan's thoughts, a cascade of curiosity and dread that pushed aside all thoughts of his abandoned software test. A profound and unsettling connection formed between the living student and the dead broadcaster. Ethan was no longer just a passive observer of data. He was a witness, 2.5 decades removed. He was the sole recipient of a message in a bottle that had been drifting through the vast, silent ocean of the electromagnetic spectrum. The burden of that knowledge settled on his shoulders with an almost physical weight. This wasn't an assignment he could simply close and forget about. He felt as though the ghost of Frank Miller had reached through time and technology to grab him, to force him to listen, to make him understand that a story had been left unfinished and a crime had gone unpunished. The end of the recording was the most haunting part. It wasn't the words, but the sounds that followed. A choked gasp, a muffled thud, the unmistakable noise of a struggle. It was a brief, brutal audio snapshot of a life being extinguished. Ethan closed his eyes and could almost see it. A dimly lit room, the warm glow of vacuum tubes, the sudden, violent intrusion of shadowy figures. The abstract data on his screen transformed into a visceral, horrifying scene. He was listening to the precise moment a man's world ended. A final, futile attempt to leave a clue for a future that he would never see. The static that followed wasn't just noise. It was the sound of absence, the sound of a life erased. He pushed his chair back abruptly, the wheels scraping against the worn linoleum floor. He needed to move, to escape the suffocating intensity of the recording. He paced the small confines of his room, from his unmade bed to the window overlooking the manicured lawns of the Johns Hopkins campus. The world outside continued on, oblivious. Students walked by, laughing and talking, their lives untouched by the 24-year-old horror that was now looping endlessly in his head. His own world, once defined by algorithms and deadlines, had been irrevocably fractured. The ghost on the frequency had shattered the sterile safety of his academic life, revealing a darker, more dangerous reality lurking just beneath the surface of the mundane. An overwhelming sense of duty began to solidify from the initial shock. He couldn't just delete the file. He couldn't dismiss it. To do so would be to participate in the man's erasure, to let the killers win again after all these years. That voice had fought against silence, broadcasting a desperate plea into the void in the hope that someone, somewhere, someday, would hear it. Ethan realized with a chilling certainty that he was that someone. He was the unintended recipient of a dead man's last will and testament, and ignoring it felt like a profound moral failure, a betrayal of the trust that had been placed in him across a chasm of time. He sat back down at his desk, his movements slow and deliberate. He created a new folder, encrypting it twice. He saved the 20-second audio clip under a new name, ghostfrequency.wave. It was more than just a file now. It was evidence. It was a testament. It was the beginning of a thread, and his logical mind couldn't resist the urge to pull on it, to see where it led. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had stumbled upon the key to a long-buried secret. This wasn't just a technical anomaly. It was a murder, captured in a digital amber, waiting for someone to finally bring it into the light. But this was just the beginning of what was to come. Before we go any further, I need your help to bring this story to light. If you're already hooked, please hit that like button, share this with someone who loves a good mystery, and subscribe to the channel, making sure to turn on all notifications. We're about to go down a very deep rabbit hole, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I have to ask you, what would you do in a situation like this? You're alone in your room and you hear a ghost from the past crying out for justice. Do you think you could handle the weight of a dead man's last words? The implicit promise of the recording was now a conscious mission. Ethan knew what he had to do next. He had to give the voice a name. He had to uncover the story behind the static, to find out who the man was and what terrible fate he met on that October night in 1989. The license plate was his first clue, a starting point for a journey into the past. He was a computer science student, not a detective, but the recording had given him a purpose that transcended his studies. He wasn't just chasing a signal anymore. He was hunting for the truth, and he was determined to find it, no matter the cost. The initial fear that had paralyzed him began to morph into a cold, focused resolve. The hum of his laptop's fan, once a monotonous background noise, now sounded like a quiet engine of justice waiting to be unleashed. His dorm room, a place of study and procrastination, had transformed into the unlikely headquarters of a cold case investigation. The ghost of Frank Miller had waited 24 years to be heard. Ethan Hayes would not let him down. The hunt had begun, and the first step was to find out everything he could about Maryland license plate XJY502 and the dark secrets it had kept hidden for more than 2 decades. To understand the silence that Ethan Hayes broke, we must travel back to a time before digital ghosts, to the analog world of 1989. In a quiet, tree-lined suburb of Baltimore, Frank Miller was the embodiment of the American everyman. At 45, he was a devoted husband, a doting father, and a reliable employee at a local electronics firm. His life was a comfortable rhythm of work, family dinners, and weekend barbecues. He wasn't a hero or an adventurer. He was a man who found profound joy in the simple, predictable patterns of his existence. His one true escape, his personal portal to the wider world, was located in the wood-paneled basement of his modest 2-story home, a sanctuary filled with the warm, amber glow of vacuum tubes and the faint smell of solder and ozone. His daughter Sarah was the center of his universe. A bright and curious 10-year-old, she saw her father as a gentle giant, a magician who could pull voices from thin air with his strange machines. She would often sit on the basement steps, watching him with wide-eyed wonder as he turned the heavy knobs of his transceiver, his face illuminated by the soft light of the frequency display. He taught her the Morse code for her own name, a secret language they shared. Their bond was forged in these quiet moments, a tapestry woven from bedtime stories, shared laughter, and the steady, reassuring presence of a father who, to Sarah, seemed as permanent and reliable as the North Star he had once pointed out to her in the night sky. Frank's passion was ham radio. It was more than a hobby. It was a connection to a global community built on curiosity and mutual respect. His station was an analog kingdom, a testament to a bygone era of craftsmanship. A large map of the world, dotted with colored pins marking every contact he'd ever made, covered one wall. For Frank, this room was a peaceful retreat from the pressures of daily life. Here, he wasn't just Frank Miller, electronics technician. He was W3FGM, a voice in the global chorus, sharing stories about weather patterns in Japan, or discussing antenna designs with a fellow operator in Germany. He was a listener, a talker, a member of a fraternity bound not by blood, but by the invisible threads of radio waves. But beyond the tranquility of Frank's suburban life, the city of Baltimore was wrestling with a darker reality. The late 1980s saw the port city caught in the throes of a burgeoning drug crisis. The Port of Baltimore, a bustling hub of international commerce, was also a porous gateway for illicit cargo. While the city's leaders promoted a narrative of urban renewal, its shadowy underbelly was controlled by syndicates vying for control of the lucrative drug trade. These were dangerous, invisible wars fought in warehouses and back alleys, far from the manicured lawns of Frank Miller's neighborhood. It was a world of coded language, secret meetings, and brutal enforcement, a world Frank knew nothing about, but one whose frequency he was about to accidentally find. When Frank Miller vanished, on the night of October 12, 1989, the official investigation quickly hit a wall. Detective Gene Russo, then a sharp, ambitious detective with the Baltimore PD, was assigned the case. He found a scene that was eerily clean. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no ransom note. Frank's car was still in the driveway, his wallet on the dresser upstairs. To his superiors, the evidence, or lack thereof, pointed to a simple, if tragic, conclusion. Frank Miller had walked away from his life. The case was quietly reclassified from a missing person to a, quote, voluntary runaway, a man who had simply decided to disappear, leaving a heartbroken family and a frustrated detective in his wake. This official narrative became a second wound for the Miller family. The initial shock and fear were replaced by a slow-burning poison of suspicion and gossip. Neighbors who once shared backyard pleasantries now exchanged hushed whispers. For young Sarah, the world became a confusing maze of unanswered questions. She was forced to navigate a life defined by her father's absence, and the cruel story that he had abandoned her. She clung to the memory of the loving man who taught her Morse code, a memory that stood in stark defiance of the official record. The uncertainty became a permanent shadow, shaping her view of the world and instilling in her a deep-seated distrust of easy answers. Meanwhile, in the same city, another man's empire was being built on a foundation of silence and violence. Marcus Thorne, then a young and hungry enforcer for a burgeoning crime syndicate, was making a name for himself. He was not a flashy gangster. He was a creature of the shadows, a man who understood that true power lay not in overt displays of force, but in meticulous planning and absolute discretion. He was the architect of his syndicate's logistics, the man who ensured that valuable shipments moved through the port undetected. He was methodical, ruthless, and utterly invisible to law enforcement. His rise was quiet, but swift, a testament to his ability to eliminate any variable that threatened his operation. On that crisp autumn evening, these two worlds were on a collision course. Frank Miller finished dinner, kissed his wife and daughter goodnight, and descended the stairs to his basement sanctuary, completely unaware that his innocent hobby was about to make him an ear witness to a crime. He settled into his worn leather chair, donned his heavy headphones, and began his nightly ritual of scanning the airwaves. Above him, his family moved through the familiar rhythms of their evening routine. The entire scene was a portrait of perfect, fragile normalcy, a single moment of peace before the static that would swallow a man's life and echo for 24 years. For Detective Gene Russo, 1989 was a year defined by ghosts. Not the supernatural kind, but the ghosts of unsolved cases that haunted the halls of the Baltimore PD. He was a good cop, a man who believed in the simple arithmetic of justice. But the city's rising tide of drug-related violence was overwhelming the system. Cases were piling up, leads were drying out, and the voluntary runaway file was becoming a convenient, if soul-crushing, repository for the inexplicable. When Frank Miller's file landed on his desk, it felt different. It lacked the usual chaos of a crime scene, the telltale signs of a life in disarray. It was a disappearance defined by a profound and unsettling neatness, a vacuum that defied easy explanation. Russo suspected foul play from day one, but with no body, no witnesses, and no motive, his suspicions were just another ghost in his personal collection. Far from the fluorescent lights of the police precinct, Marcus Thorne operated in a world of calculated shadows. In 1989, he was the quiet architect behind a burgeoning criminal enterprise, a man who understood that true power was built not on brazen violence, but on flawless logistics and absolute silence. He viewed the flashy, loud-mouthed gangsters of his time with disdain. They were amateurs who invited scrutiny. Thorne, by contrast, was a master of invisibility. His domain was the port of Baltimore, a sprawling, chaotic labyrinth that he was methodically taming into a ruthlessly efficient pipeline for his syndicate's illicit cargo. He was the ghost in the city's economic machine, moving millions in product under the noses of authorities, his name unknown, his presence felt only by the ripples of his influence. The shipment scheduled for the night of October 12th was pivotal. It wasn't just another delivery. It was the culmination of months of planning, the inaugural run of a new, sophisticated smuggling route that Thorne himself had designed. This operation was meant to be his masterpiece, a demonstration of his strategic genius that would elevate him from a valuable enforcer to an indispensable partner in the syndicate. The stakes were astronomical. Success would secure his future and vastly expand his organization's territory. Failure was not merely an option. It was an existential threat to everything he was building. Every detail had been meticulously planned, every contingency considered, except for the quiet hobbyist in the suburban basement, turning a dial at precisely the wrong moment. In the years that followed, the official narrative of her father's abandonment became a cruel shadow that clung to Sarah Miller. The story didn't just rob her of a father. It tainted his memory, turning a beloved figure into a source of shame and speculation. As a child, she weathered the storm of whispers and pitying glances with a quiet defiance, holding on to the image of the gentle man who taught her Morse code and smelled of solder and coffee. This early trauma forged her into a woman who was both deeply empathetic and fiercely skeptical. She learned to question every easy answer, to distrust official stories. Her entire life became an unconscious search for a truth that felt more real than the one she had been given, a quiet, decades-long investigation fueled by a daughter's unwavering belief in her father's love. 24 years later, in the sterile, brightly lit world of Johns Hopkins University, Ethan Hayes lived a life governed by a different set of rules. His universe was one of binary logic, elegant algorithms, and the clean, predictable flow of data. He was a prodigy in his field, but socially, he was an island, more comfortable conversing with a command line than with his classmates. His project to sweep abandoned radio frequencies was born not from a desire to connect with the past, but from a purely intellectual challenge. He wanted to prove his software could sift through digital noise with unparalleled efficiency. The human stories behind the static were irrelevant variables in his equation. He was a digital archaeologist looking for patterns in the dust, completely unaware that he was about to unearth a ghost. The contrast between Frank Miller's world and Ethan Hayes's could not have been more stark. Frank's basement was an analog sanctuary, a warm and tangible space filled with glowing tubes and the crackle of human voices traveling across continents. His technology was a bridge for connection. Ethan's dorm room was a digital laboratory, a cool, sterile environment where the only warmth came from the heat vent of his laptop. His technology was a tool for extraction, designed to isolate and analyze data with cold, impartial precision. These two worlds, separated by a generation of technological revolution, were about to collide. The emotional human tragedy of 1989 was about to be filtered through the dispassionate logic of 2013, a process that would be the only hope for its resolution. The frequency itself was a relic, a digital graveyard. It was an old municipal services band, made obsolete in the early 1990s as communications shifted to more secure, encrypted digital systems. Once bustling with the chatter of city life, it had fallen silent, a forgotten highway on the vast spectrum of the airwaves. No one listened to it anymore. There was no reason to. It was this very obscurity that made it the perfect vessel for Frank Miller's final message. His desperate voice became trapped in a pocket of silence, an electronic ghost town where it could echo undisturbed for decades. It was a message waiting not just for a listener, but for a specific kind of listener, someone with the technology and the curiosity to explore the abandoned places of the digital world. And so, the pieces were set on their collision course across time. In a sleek corporate office overlooking the very port he had conquered, a graying Marcus Thorne conducted his legitimate business. The foundations of his success, concrete, steel, and bone, buried deep in the past. He was a man who had successfully outrun his own history. Miles away, in a cluttered dorm room, a young man named Ethan Hayes compiled his code for a final test run. He was about to cast a digital net into an ocean of forgotten noise. He was simply looking for anomalies in the data, unaware that the biggest anomaly of all was the ghost of a man named Frank Miller, a ghost who had waited 24 years to finally speak. Ethan's first move was to retreat into the world he understood best, the world of pure data. He spent the next 48 hours in a self-imposed exile, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a burning obsession. He treated the 20-second audio clip not as a voice, but as a corrupted dataset. He ran the waveform through a cascade of digital filters, each one designed to meticulously shave away another layer of the 24-year-old static. He used spectral analysis to isolate the specific frequency range of a human male voice, amplifying it while suppressing the hiss of the empty airwaves. The process was methodical, almost surgical. With each pass of his proprietary algorithm, the ghost in the machine grew clearer, its form emerging from the digital fog. He wasn't just cleaning up a recording. He felt like he was performing a digital resuscitation. breathing life back into a voice that had been silenced for a generation. The result was terrifyingly clear. The layers of decay peeled back to reveal a voice that was no longer a faint echo but a sharp, present plea. Ethan listened, headphones pressed tight against his ears, as the man's final words now cut through the silence with chilling precision. "They're here. They're outside," the voice stammered, the panic raw and unfiltered. "A big sedan, dark blue, license plate XJY 502. Maryland plate XJY 502. But there was more now, details that had been buried in the noise. One is tall, a scar on his eyebrow. The other is younger. They call him Thorn. The loop ended with the same choked gasp, but now it was followed by the distinct, sickening sound of a heavy object striking flesh. It was no longer an ambiguous struggle. It was the unmistakable sound of a murder, captured and preserved in perfect, horrifying fidelity. With the cleaned audio file burning a hole in his hard drive, Ethan was paralyzed by a new kind of fear, the fear of what to do next. His logical mind ran through the scenarios, and none of them seemed viable. Walk into a Baltimore police station? A 21-year-old student with a wild story about a ghost voice he found on an abandoned radio frequency? They would dismiss him as a crank, a delusional kid playing with a sound mixer. He imagined the condescending looks, the polite but firm dismissal. He had a piece of evidence that felt monumental, world-changing, but he knew that in the cold, bureaucratic light of day, it was just a strange audio file with no provenance, no context, and no credibility. The weight of the secret was crushing, and the path forward was shrouded in a fog of uncertainty and institutional disbelief. After another sleepless night, a solution emerged from the depths of his digital native instincts. If the official channels were closed to him, he would create his own. He navigated to a niche corner of the internet, a forum called Unsolved Echoes, a community of amateur sleuths, retired law enforcement, and grieving family members dedicated to breathing life into cold cases. Under the anonymous handle, Listener21, he wrote a simple, non-committal post. Found this audio anomaly on an old frequency. Sounds like it's from the late 80s. Can anyone identify the context? He attached the cleaned 20-second clip, ghost frequency _clean.wav, and hit post. He had cast the message back into the sea, not an ocean of radio waves, but one of collective, anonymous curiosity, hoping for a different kind of listener to find it this time. Days turned into a week. The initial adrenaline of his discovery curdled into a gnawing anxiety. Ethan found himself compulsively refreshing the forum page, his academic work completely abandoned. The post had garnered a few dozen views and a handful of replies. Probably a radio drama, one user suggested. Sounds like a hoax, another commented flatly. Each dismissive comment felt like a small shovel of dirt being thrown onto Frank Miller's digital coffin. Doubt began to creep in. Was he the delusional one after all? Had he built a grand conspiracy out of a meaningless piece of audio flotsam? The ghost's voice, once so urgent and real, began to feel like a figment of his own obsessed imagination. He was on the verge of deleting the post and trying to forget the whole thing, to return to the sterile certainty of his code. Miles away, in a quiet suburban classroom, 34-year-old Sarah Miller was grading papers when her phone buzzed. It was a link from a friend who followed true crime forums, sent with the casual message, "This is weird, thought of you." Sarah sighed. Over the years, she had been sent countless links, each one a dead end that only reopened old wounds. She had learned to guard her hope fiercely, encasing it in a thick layer of skepticism. With a sense of weary obligation, she clicked the link to the Unsolved Echoes forum. She saw the anonymous post and the attached audio file. Her finger hovered over the play button, her heart bracing for the familiar pang of disappointment. She expected another hoax, another false echo, another reminder of the silence that had defined most of her life. She pressed play. The first sound she heard was the static, a familiar nothingness. Then, the voice cut through, panicked and desperate. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a voice she hadn't heard in 24 years, a voice she only knew from fading home videos and her own fractured childhood memories. It was older, strained with a terror she couldn't comprehend, but it was unmistakably his. The final, irrefutable proof, however, wasn't in the words or the fear. It was in the sound just before he spoke the license plate number for the first time, a tiny, almost imperceptible clearing of his throat. It was a habit, a small, intimate tick he always did before keying his microphone. In that moment, 24 years of uncertainty, of whispers and official reports, evaporated in a flood of gut-wrenching, absolute certainty. It was him. Tears streamed down Sarah's face, blurring the screen of her laptop. It was a torrent of grief and vindication, a storm of emotion that had been building for over 2 decades. The ghost she had lived with her entire life finally had a voice. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely type, but she managed to create an account on the forum. She navigated to Listener 21's profile and clicked Send Private Message. She didn't think about the implications, about who this person was or if it was a trap. All she knew was that this anonymous stranger held the key to the truth she had been denied. Her message was short, each word heavy with the weight of a lifetime of waiting. "Where did you get this recording?" she typed. "That man you heard, that was my father." Ethan stared at the private message on his screen, the simple, declarative sentence hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "That man you heard, that was my father." The anonymity of the internet, the safe distance he had maintained from his discovery, evaporated in an instant. The waveform on his monitor was no longer an abstract data set, a technical curiosity. It was Frank Miller, a father, a man whose daughter had just reached out across a digital void of 24 years. The ghost in his machine suddenly had a family, a history, a life that had been violently stolen. An immense, terrifying weight settled onto his shoulders. He wasn't just a listener who had stumbled upon a secret. He was now a custodian of a family's tragedy, and his next move would determine whether that secret remained buried or was finally brought into the light of day. Their first conversation was a hesitant video call, a study in contrasts that spanned a generation. Ethan sat in his sterile dorm room, the blue light of his multiple monitors casting a cool, analytical glow on his face. On his screen, Sarah Miller sat in a warmly lit living room, a bookshelf overflowing with novels behind her, and a small, framed photo of a smiling man with a kind face, Frank, just over her shoulder. For the first few minutes, the silence was heavy, broken only by stilted pleasantries. But then Sarah began to speak, her voice steady, despite the tears welling in her eyes, and the awkwardness dissolved, replaced by a shared, laser-focused intensity. She was looking at the young man who held her father's last breath on a hard drive, and he was looking at the living, breathing consequence of a murder he'd unearthed. Sarah recounted the painful history that had defined her life, the official police report labeling her father a voluntary runaway, the quiet shame that had settled over her family, the whispers in their suburban neighborhood. She explained how the official narrative never squared with the man she knew, the devoted father who taught her Morse code and spent hours patiently explaining how radio waves could carry a voice around the world. As Ethan listened, the case transformed from an intellectual puzzle into a profound human drama. This wasn't about data or algorithms anymore. It was about a 10-year-old girl who was told her hero had abandoned her, and who had spent the next 24 years refusing to believe it. Her pain, raw and palpable even through the compressed video feed, solidified his resolve. He had to help her find the truth. "He kept journals," Sarah said suddenly, her eyes lighting up with a flicker of memory. "Logbooks for his radio contacts. I have them all, stored in a box in the attic." She described them with a daughter's fond recollection. Thick, leather-bound ledgers, filled with her father's neat, technical handwriting. They were artifacts of a life he loved, filled with call signs, signal strengths, and notes on atmospheric conditions. For years, they had been a painful reminder, a collection of indecipherable jargon she couldn't bring herself to discard. Now, she realized, they might be something more. They were a potential roadmap of her father's final days, a physical record from the past that could give context to the digital echo Ethan had discovered. She promised to retrieve them immediately, her voice filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Later that evening, another call. Sarah had the journal spread out on her dining room table, the old paper smelling faintly of dust and time. At Ethan's direction, she turned to the entries for October 1989. Her breath hitched as she read aloud from an entry dated October 10th, just 2 days before her father vanished. Hearing unusual, coded traffic on the old municipal band, 47.42 megahertz, she read, her finger tracing the faded blue ink. Not standard ham protocol. Sounds professional, almost military. Something about the port. We'll monitor. Ethan felt a jolt of adrenaline. 47.42 megahertz. It was the exact frequency. This was the missing piece of the puzzle. Frank Miller hadn't stumbled upon that transmission by accident. He had found it, identified it as suspicious, and was actively investigating it. He was a witness, not by chance, but by his own determined curiosity. The journal entry was the bridge that connected Frank's analog world to Ethan's digital one. It confirmed that the voice in the recording wasn't a random victim, but a man who had gotten too close to a dangerous secret. The coded traffic, the mention of the port, the professional tone, it all aligned with the panicked final broadcast. Frank Miller, the quiet suburban hobbyist, had been conducting his own investigation from the safety of his basement. He had been a lone sentinel, listening to the city's secret conversations, completely unaware that the secrets were listening back. The journal transformed the narrative from a simple disappearance to the silencing of a citizen investigator, a man who had used his hobby to uncover a crime in progress and paid the ultimate price for his discovery. A new dynamic solidified between them. They were no longer a grieving daughter and a curious student. They were partners. Ethan, with his ability to dissect the digital evidence, and Sarah, with her intimate connection to the past and the physical artifacts her father had left behind. Their goal became clear. They had to find someone in law enforcement who would listen. A cold case unit might be an option, but they needed more than that. They needed someone who remembered the original investigation, someone who might have shared the same doubts that haunted Sarah for decades. The original detective, Sarah mused, pulling up an old newspaper clipping on her laptop. His name was Gene Russo. I wonder if he's still around. The name hung in the air, a potential key to unlocking the official doors that had been closed for so long. The call ended, but the mission had just begun. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt a purpose that extended beyond the clean logic of his code. He was now inextricably linked to Frank Miller's fate, a modern-day proxy for a ghost demanding justice. For Sarah, 24 years of passive grief had been ignited into active pursuit. The voice of her father had not only confirmed her faith in him, but had also given her a clear path forward. They both knew the risks. The recording contained a name, Thorne, and the men who had gone to such lengths to ensure Frank Miller's silence would not hesitate to do so again. Their investigation was no longer just about uncovering the past. It was a direct challenge to a powerful enemy who had been hiding in plain sight for a generation. Finding Gene Russo was like searching for a ghost of a different kind. Sarah's research led them not to a bustling police precinct, but to a quiet, manicured retirement community on the outskirts of Annapolis. Russo's house was a small, unassuming cottage with a perfectly tended garden that seemed at odds with the man who answered the door. He was a stooped figure with eyes that held the weary weight of 1,000 grim stories. He listened to their introduction with a practiced patience, a mask of polite disinterest that he had likely perfected over decades of dealing with the public. When Sarah mentioned her father's name, Frank Miller, a flicker of something, recognition, regret, crossed his face for a fraction of a second before the mask was back in place. He invited them in, but his posture was closed, his arms crossed, a silent wall already built between them. Initially, Russo was dismissive, his tone laced with the gentle condescension of a man who believed he had heard every possible theory. He leaned back in his worn armchair, a relic from another era, and listened as Ethan nervously explained the concept of sweeping abandoned frequencies. Russo's expression remained unchanged, a stony mask of skepticism. "A ghost on the radio," he said, the words dripping with cynicism. "Son, in 30 years on the force, I've had people bring me psychic visions, dreams, messages from their Ouija boards. A story is not evidence." He looked at Sarah with a hint of pity, seeing her not as a partner in an investigation, but as another grieving daughter, clinging to a fantastical hope, unable to accept the simple, ugly truth that people sometimes just leave. He was ready to show them the door, to close this chapter just as he had 24 years ago. The turning point came not with words, but with sound. Seeing he was losing him, Ethan simply opened his laptop, placed it on the coffee table between them, and pressed play. The cleaned audio filled the quiet room, Frank Miller's voice cutting through the decades with terrifying clarity. "License plate XJY502. They call him Thorn." Gene Russo froze, his body going rigid in the armchair. He leaned forward, his cynical gaze sharpening into one of pure, unadulterated focus. He wasn't just hearing a recording, he was hearing a witness statement from beyond the grave. The raw terror in the voice, the specific, actionable details. It was everything he had lacked in 1989. This wasn't a psychic's fantasy. It was a primary source, a man broadcasting his own murder as it happened. The ghost was real, and in that moment, the cold case of Frank Miller became active once more in the mind of the one man who never truly let it go. A fire long thought extinguished was reignited in Russo's eyes. He agreed to help, though he made it clear it had to be completely off the books. His badge was a memory, but his contacts were not. He retreated to his study, a room filled with dusty case files and framed commendations, and made a call. His voice was different now, stripped of its weary resignation and filled with the clipped, authoritative tone of a seasoned detective. "Mickey, it's Jane," he grunted into the phone. "I need a favor, a big one. It's for an old ghost of mine." He gave the contact the Maryland license plate, XJY502, asking him to run it through the DMV archives, to dig as deep as the records went, and to be discreet. As he hung up, he looked at Ethan and Sarah, a silent understanding passing between them. They were no longer just two civilians with a recording. They were a team, and they had just brought a sleeping giant back into the fight. The call back from Russo's contact came less than 24 hours later, and the information it carried was a bombshell that blew the case wide open. The license plate XJY502 was registered to a 1988 Lincoln Town car. The owner was not a person, but a corporation, Chesapeake Maritime Solutions, a small, insignificant logistics company that had dissolved in the early 90s. But Russo's friend hadn't stopped there. He had followed the paper trail. Chesapeake Maritime Solutions had been bought out, its assets absorbed by another company, which was then acquired by a larger holding firm. After a series of complex mergers and name changes designed to obscure its origins, the lineage led to one place: Thorn Maritime Logistics, one of the largest and most respected shipping corporations on the East Coast, a pillar of Baltimore's modern economy. The past wasn't just connected to the present, it was its very foundation. The name hit them like a physical shock: Thorn. The name the ghost on the frequency had whispered with his dying breath. The CEO and public face of Thorn Maritime Logistics was Marcus Thorn, a man known for his civic contributions, his political connections, and his carefully cultivated image as a self-made titan of industry. Suddenly, the scope of their investigation expanded exponentially. This was no longer about a small-time drug deal gone wrong. It was about a powerful, untouchable figure whose entire empire was potentially built on the murder of a suburban ham radio operator. The stakes had been raised to a terrifying new level. They were not just chasing ghosts anymore, they were targeting a king, and they knew that kings do not give up their thrones without a fight. The silence Frank Miller broke was the same silence that had protected Marcus Thorn for 24 years. Energized by the lead, Russo drove down to the Baltimore PD archives. using his old credentials and a bit of well-placed charm to gain access to the physical case file for Frank Miller's disappearance. Under the yellowed fluorescent lights, the three of them hunched over the box of brittle paper, the official story of a man who simply walked away. But buried deep within the supplementary reports was a neighborhood canvas statement, a minor detail Russo had overlooked at the time. An elderly neighbor, now long deceased, had reported seeing an unfamiliar dark sedan parked down the street on the night Frank vanished. She mentioned two men. One she couldn't see clearly. The other, who got out to smoke a cigarette under a streetlight, was tall and had, in her words, a nasty-looking scar right through his eyebrow. Russo's breath caught in his throat. He knew that description. He spent the next hour cross-referencing old informant files from the late 80s, and then he found him. James "Jimmy the Scar" Petrelli, a known enforcer for one of the city's nascent drug syndicates. He was a violent, feared figure in the criminal underworld of that era. He was the muscle. The pieces began to click into place with sickening clarity. Thorne was the strategist, the younger one Frank had mentioned, and Petrelli was the enforcer, the tall guy with a scar. They were a team. A final, chilling search of Petrelli's own file revealed his fate. Found in a South Baltimore alley in 1990 with 2 bullets in the back of his head. The official cause of death was a rival gang hit. But Russo knew better. It was a loose end, tied up with cold, ruthless efficiency by his ambitious young partner. Their investigation, however quiet, had not gone unnoticed. Russo's official request for the Miller case file, even coming from a retired detective, had tripped a digital flag in the system. That flag sent an automated, encrypted alert to a high-ranking official within the Baltimore Police Department, an official who had been on Marcus Thorne's payroll for over 2 decades. In his sleek, top-floor office overlooking the very port he controlled, Thorne received the call. The voice on the other end was brief and professional, informing him that an inquiry had been made into a cold case from 1989. A case involving a missing person named Frank Miller. Thorne felt a cold dread, an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. The ghost he had buried under a mountain of concrete and time had somehow found a way to claw itself back to the surface. The warning was swift, subtle, and utterly terrifying. Ethan returned to his dorm room late one night after a long session with Sarah and Russo. He knew instantly that something was wrong. The air was different, the neat stacks of his textbooks slightly askew. Nothing appeared to be stolen, but the violation was unmistakable. Someone had been there. His heart hammered in his chest as his eyes scanned the room, searching for the message he knew had been left for him. He found it sitting in the center of his desk, placed with surgical precision next to his state-of-the-art laptop. It was a vintage Kenwood transceiver, an old ham radio almost identical to the one he'd seen in pictures of Frank Miller's basement. It was a ghost from the past, a silent, chilling message that said, "We know who you are. We know what you're looking for. Stop." The playful thrill of solving a historical puzzle evaporated, replaced by the cold, sharp reality of imminent danger. The transceiver on his desk was not just a warning, it was a promise. It was Marcus Thorne reaching out from the shadows, demonstrating his power and his reach. He could get into a locked university dorm room without leaving a trace. He could find them. The investigation was no longer about uncovering the truth for a grieving daughter. It had escalated into a direct confrontation with an active, powerful, and utterly ruthless criminal who had already killed once to protect his secret. They had successfully resurrected the ghost of Frank Miller, but in doing so, they had also awakened the monster who created him, and now that monster was hunting them. The cold, heavy weight of the vintage transceiver sat on Ethan's desk like a tombstone. The initial shock had subsided, replaced by a low-frequency hum of pure terror that vibrated deep in his bones. This was no longer a digital mystery, a ghost story confined to the safe, sterile glow of his monitor. The threat had crossed the threshold from the ethereal to the physical. It had a weight, a smell of old dust and ozone, and it was now in his room. He grabbed his phone, his fingers fumbling with the screen, and called Russo. His voice, usually so calm and measured, was a ragged whisper. "He was here," Ethan stammered, his eyes locked on the radio. "Russo, he was in my room. He left a message." He described the transceiver, the silent, terrifying symbol of Frank Miller's life and death, now repurposed as a promise of what was to come for them. Gene Russo listened on the other end, the silence on his line more potent than any words. He wasn't surprised. He was grimly impressed. "That's Thorne's style," Russo finally said, his voice a low growl of grudging respect. "Not brute force, not yet. He's a chess player. This is a psychological move, meant to paralyze you with fear, to make you second-guess every shadow." The old detective's mind, long dormant, was now operating at full capacity. He issued a string of curt, non-negotiable orders: burner phones only, no more personal devices, no more meetings at their homes, public places, crowded and anonymous. He instructed them to vary their routes, to check their cars before getting in. The hunt for a ghost had officially become a counterintelligence operation against a very real, very powerful monster. Thorne wasn't just warning them, he was testing their resolve, waiting for them to break. The flagrant breach of Ethan's dorm room did more than scare Russo. It enraged him. He knew Thorne couldn't have pulled that off without high-level help. The carefully constructed wall of institutional procedure at a place like Johns Hopkins was not easily bypassed. This confirmed his deepest fear. The corruption wasn't just a passive source of information for Thorne, it was an active arm of his enterprise. Russo made a call he had been dreading for years, to a retired internal affairs captain, a man named Henderson, who was as cynical and paranoid as he was. Without giving away all the details, Russo explained his theory about the Miller case file being flagged. Henderson wasn't shocked. He spoke of long-held suspicions about a fixer in the upper echelons of the BPD, a ghost in the department's own machine who had been sanitizing files and burying inconvenient truths for 2 decades. The conspiracy was larger and more entrenched than they could have imagined. While Russo probed the network of corruption, Sarah channeled her grief and fear into a different kind of investigation. She wanted to understand the man who had built an empire on her father's grave. She spent days buried in the microfilm archives of the Baltimore Public Library, scrolling through 2 decades of business journals and financial reports. The official story of Marcus Thorne was one of bootstrap success, but Sarah found the cracks. She traced the initial funding for Thorne Maritime back to a labyrinth of offshore accounts and shell corporations registered in Panama and the Cayman Islands in the early 1990s. It was a classic money laundering architecture. Frank Miller hadn't just overheard a plan for a single drug shipment. He had tuned into the founding transaction of a criminal dynasty, the very moment the seed money for Thorne's legitimate empire was being illegally injected into the system. Back in his now violated dorm room, Ethan fought his terror by retreating into the cold certainty of science. The transceiver on his desk was a constant, terrifying reminder, but he used it as fuel. He turned his attention back to the recording, focusing not on the words but on the signal's properties. He cross-referenced Frank's logbook, which detailed the atmospheric conditions on October 12, 1989, with historical weather data and old radio frequency allocation charts. He explained his theory to Sarah and Russo in a hushed call from a library payphone. Radio waves, especially on those old low-band VHF frequencies, are affected by geography and infrastructure. Using the known locations of 1980s municipal relay towers as fixed points, he believed he could triangulate the origin of the killer's broadcast. He wasn't just chasing a voice anymore. He was chasing its echo back to the source. The concept of a broadcast origin point lit a fuse in Gene Russo's memory. He spent a night with old city maps and crime statistics from his era spread across his floor. In the late 80s and early 90s, there was a specific patch of undeveloped marshland near the port, that had been a magnet for criminal activity. It was a lawless zone, a dumping ground for bodies and stolen cars, a place where jurisdictional lines blurred and patrols were scarce. It was the perfect blind spot for a clandestine operation. As Ethan fed him coordinates from his developing triangulation model, the search area narrowed, tightening like a noose around that very same patch of forgotten land. The geography of the past was beginning to align with the data of the present, pointing them toward a specific, desolate location. The final piece of the puzzle came from Sarah. Her financial research had led her to Thorn Maritime's early real estate acquisitions. Her heart stopped when she saw the document, a land purchase agreement from 1990. For a fraction of its market value, Marcus Thorn had purchased a massive, 50-acre tract of unusable marshland from the city. The location on the deed matched Ethan's triangulated coordinates and Russo's crime-ridden dead zone perfectly. On that land, Thorn built his first major asset, Warehouse 7, the cornerstone of his entire logistics empire. The horrifying truth settled upon them with the crushing weight of concrete. Frank Miller wasn't in a ditch or at the bottom of the harbor. He was under their feet, buried in the very foundation of his killer's success. This revelation was a brutal, visceral blow for Sarah. The quest for justice had suddenly become a grim mission for her father's body. Warehouse 7 was a landmark in the city, a symbol of Baltimore's economic strength she had driven past 100 times. Now she saw it for what it truly was, her father's unmarked mausoleum. The knowledge was a poison, filling her with a cold, sickening dread, but it also forged her grief into an unbreakable resolve. During their next clandestine meeting, her voice was low but steady, stripped of all tears. "We have to get him out," she told them, her gaze unwavering. "I don't care what it takes. I'm not leaving him there. We have to bring him home." Her pain became the moral compass for their perilous journey, a stark reminder of the human cost of Thorn's silence. Their activities, however discreet, had triggered the system. Russo's conversation with his old IA contact was the final straw. The Mole, now a deputy commissioner with a pristine reputation, acted swiftly to neutralize the threat. An internal BPD memo was circulated, a masterpiece of bureaucratic assassination. It didn't mention Thorn or the Miller case. It simply warned all active personnel to sever contact with retired Detective Gene Russo, citing his increasingly erratic behavior and unhealthy fixation on long-closed cases. In a single keystroke, Russo was officially branded a pariah. His last few allies in the department went silent, their calls suddenly going straight to voicemail. The official doors had not just been closed, they had been bolted, and the institution he had dedicated his life to was now actively working against him. With their official avenues cut off, Thorn escalated his intimidation from symbolic warnings to direct, personal threats. One evening, as Sarah drove home from her teaching job, a black SUV with heavily tinted windows appeared behind her. It wasn't just following, it was hunting. The vehicle stayed glued to her bumper, its powerful engine a constant, menacing growl. On a dark, empty stretch of road, it accelerated, its high beams flashing, blinding her in her rearview mirror. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she gripped the steering wheel, bracing for impact. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the SUV swerved violently and sped off down a side street, disappearing into the night. It was a calculated act of terror, a clear message from Thorn. "We can touch you whenever we want. You are not safe." The three of them met in a booth at the back of a bustling 24-hour diner, the clatter of plates and hum of conversation providing a fragile shield of anonymity. The fear was a fourth person at the table, a cold and silent presence. Ethan's hands trembled as he drank his coffee. Sarah kept glancing toward the door. But beneath the fear, a new, harder emotion had taken root. Defiance. They had the killer, the motive, and the burial site. What they lacked was a path forward. Russo laid it out in stark terms. "He's isolated us," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He's cut us off, and now he's trying to break us. Our only move is to go all in. Their only option was a desperate, long-shot gamble. Find an incorruptible judge, someone outside the BPD's sphere of influence, and convince them to sign a search warrant for Warehouse 7. It was a move that would either expose the truth or sign their death warrants. The air was cold and sharp with the metallic tang of the harbor as dawn broke over Baltimore. A fleet of unmarked police vehicles descended on Warehouse 7, their movements swift and silent, a stark contrast to the hulking monolithic structure they surrounded. The warehouse stood as a monument to Marcus Thorne's success, a silent, concrete tombstone that had guarded its secret for 24 years. Kept at a safe distance behind a police cordon, Ethan, Sarah, and Jean Russo watched, the culmination of their desperate gamble unfolding before them. The cold seeped into their bones, a physical manifestation of the dread and fragile hope that hung in the air. For Sarah, the building was no longer just steel and concrete. It was a living entity, a monster that had swallowed her father whole, and they were here to cut him out. The raid was a study in controlled chaos. A tactical team secured the vast, cavernous interior, while forensics specialists rolled in carts loaded with ground-penetrating radar equipment. The search warrant, signed by a federal judge outside Thorne's sphere of influence, was ironclad. Thorne's lawyers, a team of impeccably dressed men who materialized out of the morning mist, protested with practiced indignation, their voices echoing in the cavernous space. But their legal maneuvering was useless against the weight of the warrant. They were spectators now, just like everyone else, forced to watch as the secrets of their client's foundation were methodically probed. Russo watched them, a grim satisfaction on his face. The walls of corruption Thorne had built were finally being breached, not by force, but by the relentless echo of a dead man's voice. Ethan stood beside one of the GPR technicians, his eyes glued to the laptop screen displaying the subterranean scans. The monitor was a chaotic mess of green and black lines, representing layers of reinforced concrete, rebar, and compacted earth. For agonizing minutes, the data was inconclusive, a digital shrug that threatened to invalidate everything. A cold knot of fear tightened in his stomach. What if he was wrong? What if his triangulation was off by a few feet? The entire case, Sarah's hope, Russo's redemption, it all rested on the ghost in his machine being right. He had followed an echo across time, and now, in this cold, dusty warehouse, he feared it would lead them to an empty grave, leaving them exposed and defenseless against Thorne's inevitable retribution. Sarah remained apart from the others, wrapped in a thick wool blanket Russo had insisted she take. She was preternaturally still, her gaze fixed on the center of the warehouse floor. Each sound, the clatter of equipment, the clipped commands of the officers, the distant cry of a gull over the harbor, seemed amplified. A prelude to a moment she both craved and dreaded. She felt strangely disconnected from her own body, an observer watching a scene from a movie about someone else's life. For 24 years, her father had been an absence, a ghost made of memory and speculation. Now, she was moments away from a physical truth, and she wasn't sure which was worse, the confirmation of a violent death or the crushing disappointment of finding nothing at all, which would mean he was truly lost forever. "We have something." A technician's voice cut through the tension. All heads turned. On the GPR screen, a distinct anomaly had appeared. It was an oblong shape, roughly 6 feet by 2, buried 15 feet down in a position that made no structural sense. It was located in the precise quadrant that Ethan's triangulation model had identified as the most probable origin of the 1989 broadcast. The digital ghost had pointed the way. A wave of nauseating vindication washed over Ethan. The math was right. The signal was real. But the shape on the screen was not just data. It was a coffin of earth and concrete, and the abstract horror of his discovery suddenly became terrifyingly, viscerally real. He looked over at Sarah, whose eyes were now wide with a mixture of terror and resolve. Russo, his face a mask of grim determination, gave a curt nod to the foreman of the excavation team. The deafening roar of a pneumatic jackhammer shattered the tense silence. a brutal, percussive sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The noise was an act of violence, an assault on the concrete that had served as Thorne's shield for a generation. Each powerful blow sent vibrations through the floor, a rhythmic, pounding heartbeat, counting down the final seconds of a decades-long secret. Dust and grit filled the air, catching in the beams of the forensic team's powerful lights, creating an ethereal haze around the growing hole in the floor. It felt less like an excavation and more like an exorcism, a violent casting out of a long-buried demon. The concrete finally gave way with a sickening crack, revealing the dark, compacted earth beneath. The air, once filled with the smell of dust and diesel, was now thick with the scent of damp soil, a primal, loamy odor of a place that had not seen the light of day for a quarter of a century. It was the smell of a grave. Sarah took an involuntary step forward, her hand covering her mouth as a muffled sob escaped. The forensic team immediately took over, swapping the heavy machinery for shovels, and then, as they dug deeper, for small hand trowels and brushes. The brutal noise was replaced by an almost sacred quiet, broken only by the soft scrape of metal on dirt and the hushed whispers of the investigators. Time seemed to slow down, each shovelful of earth an eternity of suspense. The first object they unearthed was not bone, but metal. A technician, using a fine bristled brush, carefully cleared away the dirt from a corroded rectangular object. As its shape became clear, Ethan felt a jolt of recognition that was both triumphant and horrifying. It was a vintage Kenwood portable transceiver, the kind a dedicated ham radio operator might keep as a backup. It was Frank Miller's field equipment. The ghost on the frequency now had a physical totem, a tangible artifact connecting the spectral voice to this dark, earthen pit. This was the microphone he had used. This was the instrument that had broadcast his own murder, a final, desperate act of witness that had taken 24 years to be understood. The circle was closing. Beneath the radio they found him. The forensic anthropologist working in the pit looked up, his expression somber, and gave Russo a slow, definitive nod. Frank Miller had been found. Russo moved instinctively to shield Sarah from the sight, to protect her from the final, brutal confirmation. But she gently pushed his arm away, her eyes clear and unwavering, fixed on the shallow grave. She had to see, she had to bear witness. This was not a monster in a horror film. This was her father, and this was the end of his story. The numbness that had protected her for hours shattered, replaced by a wave of profound, soul-crushing grief. Yet, she did not look away. She owed him this. She owed him her presence at the end of his long, lonely vigil. As the team worked to carefully exhume the remains, a glint of metal caught the light. A technician picked it up with a pair of tweezers and placed it in an evidence bag. It was a small, tarnished keychain, blackened by years in the earth. Russo brought it over to Sarah. Inside the plastic, she could see 2 pieces of thick copper wire, twisted with a familiar, practiced precision. Her breath hitched, a sharp, ragged gasp of pain and recognition. It was the keychain he had made for her 10th birthday, a few weeks before he vanished. It was Morse code, a secret language between a father and daughter. It spelled out her name, Sarah. The official story was that he abandoned her. The truth was that he had carried her name with him into his grave. That small, insignificant object was the final, devastating blow. The dam of composure Sarah had maintained for decades finally broke. A deep, guttural sob tore from her throat, a sound of pure, undiluted agony that echoed through the vast warehouse. She sank to her knees, clutching the evidence bag containing the keychain, the cold plastic, a fragile link to her father's last moments. It was not a cry of victory or even of relief. It was a lament for a stolen childhood, for a life lived under a shadow of lies, for the good, kind man who had been reduced to an anomaly on a GPR screen. Ethan and Russo stood beside her, their own emotions raw, sharing in a grief that was too immense for one person to bear alone. The ghost had a name, and now his daughter was finally able to mourn him. Across the warehouse, Marcus Thorne watched, flanked by his lawyers. He had been compelled by the warrant to be present for the search, a final humiliation orchestrated by Russo. His face was an unreadable mask of cold indifference, but as Sarah's cry echoed in the silence, a flicker of something ancient and ugly, fear, flashed in his eyes. It was the look of a king watching his fortress crumble, of a man whose carefully constructed reality was being dismantled before him. Russo walked slowly toward him, his footsteps the only sound in the cavernous space. He stopped directly in front of Thorne, their eyes locking. "Frank Miller," Russo said, his voice low and steady, each word a hammer blow. "He remembers you, Marcus, and now so do we." As the first true rays of sunlight streamed through the high, grimy windows of Warehouse 7, uniformed officers moved in. The clink of handcuffs being fastened around Marcus Thorne's wrists was a small, sharp sound that seemed to seal the end of an era. The flashes of news cameras, which had gathered outside the cordon, erupted in a frenzy, capturing the image of the business titan, the city benefactor, being led away like a common criminal. The empire built on a foundation of silence and bone had finally fallen. For Ethan, it was the stunning, real-world conclusion to a digital puzzle. For Russo, it was the closing of a wound that had festered for half his life. But for Sarah, kneeling on the cold concrete floor and clutching a small wire keychain, it was simply a tragic, heartbreaking, and long overdue homecoming. The conviction of Marcus Thorne was not a quiet affair. It was a seismic event that sent shockwaves through Baltimore's political and business establishments. The trial became a media spectacle, a modern-day ghost story, where technology had resurrected a 24-year-old murder victim to testify against his killer. The prosecution built its case on a powerful, unprecedented foundation, the digital echo of Frank Miller's last words. Ethan Hayes' meticulously documented process of isolating and cleaning the audio was presented as irrefutable digital forensics. The defense's attempts to paint the recording as a sophisticated hoax crumbled under the weight of expert testimony that verified the signal's age and atmospheric decay, proving it could not have been a modern fabrication. The ghost in the machine was authenticated by science, its voice becoming the most powerful witness in the courtroom, an incorruptible accuser from beyond the grave. The physical evidence unearthed from beneath Warehouse 7 formed the concrete anchor for the spectral voice. Forensic analysis of Frank Miller's remains confirmed the cause of death as multiple instances of severe blunt force trauma to the skull, a finding chillingly consistent with the final, sickening sounds on the recording. The corroded Kenwood transceiver found with his body was a direct link between the man in the grave and the voice on the frequency. Furthermore, soil and concrete samples from the burial site perfectly matched the composition of the original 1990 foundation pour, proving he had been interred during the warehouse's construction. Each piece of physical evidence systematically dismantled Thorne's defense, transforming the fantastic story of a ghost frequency into a grim, undeniable reality of a murder and its meticulous concealment. The fall of Marcus Thorne triggered a cascade of consequences that reached the highest levels of the Baltimore Police Department. The investigation into his finances and communications, initiated after his arrest, quickly unearthed a trail of encrypted payments leading directly to Deputy Commissioner Reynolds, the long-suspected mole. Reynolds was the fixer, the ghost inside the BPD who had protected Thorne for decades, sanitizing files, rerouting investigations, and ensuring the silence surrounding Frank Miller's disappearance remained absolute. His arrest for corruption and obstruction of justice sent a tremor through the city's power structure, exposing a rot that had festered for a generation and initiating a sweeping internal affairs investigation that promised to purge the department of its deepest shadows. The conspiracy Frank Miller had stumbled upon was far larger than a single drug shipment. It was the foundation of a corrupt symbiosis between crime and law enforcement. Sarah Miller's testimony was the emotional heart of the trial. She did not speak of radio frequencies or spectral analysis. She spoke of a father. On the stand, she recounted memories of a gentle, patient man who smelled of solder and coffee, who taught her Morse code as their secret language. Her voice, thick with an emotion held in check for 24 years, wavered only once, when the prosecutor presented the tarnished keychain into evidence. She explained to the jury what the twisted wires meant, spelling out her own name. The official story was that he abandoned me," she said, her gaze locking with Thorne's across the courtroom. "The truth is, he carried my name with him into his grave." In that moment, Frank Miller was no longer a disembodied voice or a set of skeletal remains. He was a father, a husband, a man whose stolen life filled the courtroom with its immense, tragic weight. Ethan Hayes, once a reclusive student more comfortable with code than with people, found himself at the center of a national media storm. His testimony was a masterclass in calm, logical explanation as he walked the jury through the complex science behind his discovery. He faced a brutal cross-examination, with Thorne's lawyers attempting to portray him as a fame-seeking hacker, a digital fantasist who concocted the entire story. Yet Ethan remained unshakable, his answers precise and grounded in fact. He wasn't driven by a desire for attention, but by a profound sense of responsibility to the voice he had accidentally unearthed. The trial transformed him. He had started the journey as a digital archaeologist looking for patterns in the dust. He ended it as a man who understood the profound human stories buried within the data and the moral obligation that came with listening to them. For Gene Russo, the trial was the final redemptive act of a long and haunted career. On the stand, he was no longer the weary, cynical retiree, but the sharp, methodical detective he had once been. He laid out the timeline of the original 1989 investigation, admitting its flaws and expressing his decades-long regret. He then meticulously connected the dots for the jury: Frank's journal entry, the description of the man with the scar matching the enforcer Jimmy Petrelli, Petrelli's subsequent gang-related murder, and the license plate that ultimately led them to Thorne. He was the bridge between the past and the present, his testimony providing the crucial context that framed the ghost frequency not as a random event, but as the final, missing piece of a puzzle he had been trying to solve for 24 years. His vindication was palpable, the closing of a wound that had defined his legacy. The jury's deliberation was remarkably short. Marcus Thorne was found guilty on all counts: murder, conspiracy, and a host of organized crime charges that had been unearthed during the investigation. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, Thorne's expression remained a mask of cold, arrogant indifference. He showed no remorse, no flicker of emotion. But as he was led from the courtroom in handcuffs for the final time, his eyes met Sarah's. For a fleeting second, the mask slipped, and in his gaze she saw not a titan of industry, but a small, petty thief, a man who had built an empire on a stolen life, and who was now being consigned to the silence and confinement he had inflicted upon her father. Justice had arrived, not with a roar, but with the quiet final click of a prison door. Weeks after the trial, Sarah held a funeral for her father. It was a small, private ceremony attended only by a few close friends, Ethan and Gene Russo. They buried his ashes next to his wife, who had passed away a decade earlier, never knowing the truth of her husband's fate. The autumn air was crisp, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. Sarah stood before the simple granite headstone and said a few words, not of anger or sorrow, but of love and gratitude. She spoke of a man who taught her to listen, to be curious, and to believe in the strength of a connection, whether it spanned a backyard fence or the entire globe. As the ceremony concluded, she placed the small, wire-wrapped keychain on the earth, a final, silent message in their secret language, a symbol of a love that had outlasted death, silence, and time itself. The ghost frequency case left an indelible mark on everyone it touched. Ethan Hayes returned to Johns Hopkins, but the sterile world of pure code no longer held the same appeal. He changed his doctoral thesis, dedicating his work to developing new algorithms specifically designed to search for and analyze fragmented, degraded human signals in vast archives of digital noise. He founded the ECHO Project, a non-profit initiative that partnered with law enforcement agencies to apply his technology to other cold cases, using his unique skills to give voice to other ghosts who were still waiting in the static. He had found his true calling, not in creating perfect systems, but in using his imperfect world of technology to mend the broken stories of the human one. Gene Russo did not return to the quiet life of retirement. Vindicated and re-energized, he accepted a position as a special consultant for the Baltimore PD's cold case unit. His legendary status as the detective who solved a 24-year-old murder with a ghost's voice made him an invaluable asset. He became a mentor to a new generation of detectives, teaching them to look beyond the obvious, to question official narratives, and to understand that no case is ever truly cold as long as someone is willing to listen. He had spent years haunted by the ghost of Frank Miller, but in finding justice for Frank, he had also found a new purpose for himself, a final, meaningful chapter in a life dedicated to the pursuit of truth. The social impact of the case was profound. It became a landmark story, a testament to the power of a single, determined voice. The phrase ghost frequency entered the public lexicon, symbolizing the idea that the past is never truly gone, and that technology could serve as a bridge to uncover long-buried truths. The case sparked a renewed public interest in amateur radio and citizen investigation, with thousands of people inspired to listen to the forgotten corners of the world. Frank Miller, the quiet suburban hobbyist, became an unlikely folk hero. He was a symbol of the ordinary citizen's power to bear witness, a reminder that even the faintest whisper of truth, if it can find a listener, can be strong enough to topple an empire. The city of Baltimore, forced to confront the deep-seated corruption the case had exposed, began a slow and painful process of reform. The investigation into Deputy Commissioner Reynolds led to further arrests and resignations, cleansing the police department of a network of complicity that had allowed men like Thorne to operate with impunity for years. Thorne Maritime Logistics was dismantled, its assets seized and liquidated, the proceeds used to fund victims' advocacy groups. The very foundation of Warehouse 7, once a symbol of Thorne's power, was now a monument to his downfall. The city, wounded but resolute, began to rebuild the public trust that had been so profoundly broken, a process that would take years, but one that began with the echo of a single honest voice. Months later, on a quiet spring afternoon, Sarah, Ethan, and Russo met at Frank Miller's grave. A small, permanent bronze plaque had been added to the headstone, a gift from the National Ham Radio Association. It featured the symbol of a radio tower and a simple inscription, W3FGM, silent key. In the radio community, it was a term of ultimate respect for a deceased operator. They stood together in comfortable silence, the shared ordeal having forged a bond between them that transcended words. The ghost had been brought home, the monster was caged, and the echo had finally been answered. Frank Miller's final, desperate transmission had ended in an eternity of static, but for the three people who had answered his call, the silence was now, at long last, filled with peace. The story of Frank Miller did not end with the closing of a prison door. It began a new life as a modern legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of power, and a story of hope shared in the quiet corners of the Internet. He was no longer Frank Miller, the suspected runaway, but Frank Miller, the first ghost of the digital age to successfully demand his own justice. His voice, once a faint, desperate plea trapped in a forgotten frequency, became a symbol of the enduring power of truth. It served as a stark reminder that the past is never truly buried, that its echoes simply wait for the right technology and the right listener to be translated from static into a clear, undeniable, and world-changing signal. His legacy was not one of a victim, but of a witness whose testimony was so powerful, it took a quarter of a century for the world to be ready to hear it. Ethan Hayes never looked at a line of code the same way again. The sterile logic of algorithms was now permanently imbued with the weight of human consequence. He completed his doctorate at Johns Hopkins, but his work was no longer theoretical. He founded the Echo Project, a non-profit organization that used his proprietary software to sift through terabytes of archived digital and analog noise for law enforcement agencies across the country. He became a new kind of detective, a digital exorcist who hunted for the spectral voices of the lost and the silenced. His dorm room experiment, born from intellectual curiosity, had given him a profound and lifelong purpose, to listen to the silence, to find the patterns in the noise, and to give a voice to the ghosts who were still waiting for their turn to speak from inside the machine. For Sarah Miller, peace arrived not as a sudden flood, but as a slow, quiet dawn after a lifetime of night. The ghost that had haunted her steps since childhood was finally at rest, replaced by the warm, solid memory of a father she could now mourn without the poison of uncertainty. She continued teaching, but her lessons were now infused with a new depth, a quiet authority on the importance of asking questions and challenging official narratives. She became a vocal advocate for the families of cold case victims, using her story as a platform to push for the funding of new forensic technologies. She had spent 24 years searching for her father, and in finding him she had also found herself, transforming her personal tragedy into a public mission to ensure that no other family would have to wait so long for the truth. Jean Rousseau found that redemption was not a destination, but a new beginning. He became a living legend within the Baltimore Police Department, the old dog who had taught the entire institution a new trick. His consultancy with the cold case unit became a full-time passion, his office a pilgrimage site for young detectives who wanted to hear the story of the ghost frequency from the man who had been there. He finally shed the cynicism that had been his armor for decades, replacing it with a fierce, paternal dedication to the truth. He had spent years being haunted by the one case he couldn't close, but in finally bringing Frank Miller home, he had exorcised his own demons, finding in his final years a sense of purpose and peace that had eluded him for his entire career. The city of Baltimore began the slow, arduous process of healing from a wound it never knew it had. The Thorne corruption scandal forced a painful but necessary reckoning within its most powerful institutions, leading to sweeping reforms and a renewed commitment to transparency. Warehouse 7, the concrete monument to a killer's success, was eventually demolished. In its place, the city, with a significant contribution from the Miller family's civil settlement, built a new public park. At its center stands a single, elegant radio tower, a silent, sculptural tribute to the quiet hobbyist whose voice had proven stronger than concrete and more enduring than a criminal empire. It became a place of quiet reflection, a symbol of a city's promise to listen more closely to the whispers of its own past. And this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The success of the ghost frequency case created a paradigm shift in forensic science. Ethan's Echo Project received a massive federal grant, allowing him to expand his operations, creating a national database of unidentified signals and digital anomalies. Law enforcement agencies from across the globe began sending him their own cold cases, their own digital dustbins filled with static-laden 911 calls, corrupted surveillance tapes, and mysterious radio intercepts. Frank Miller's case was the proof of concept, the single, clear signal that proved the static was not empty. It was a library of secrets, an archive of last words and dying whispers, and the world was only just beginning to learn how to read it. The lines between technology and memory, between a signal and a spirit, had been forever blurred. The case proved that our digital world is not just a repository of our present, but a vast, unintentional archive of our past. Every broadcast, every call, every signal sent out into the ether leaves a faint, ethereal trace, an electronic ghost that continues to travel through the silence long after its source is gone. Frank Miller's voice was not a supernatural event. It was a scientific inevitability, a predictable consequence of a world that had filled its atmosphere with its own stories. It was a testament to the idea that nothing is ever truly lost. It is merely waiting in a different state of being, waiting for the right tool to bring it back into focus. The static that once represented nothingness now held a different meaning. It was no longer the sound of absence, but the sound of potential. It was the collective hum of a million unresolved stories, a chorus of faint overlapping whispers that form the background noise of our modern world. It is the sound of a missing hiker's final radio call, buried under decades of atmospheric noise. It is the sound of a fragmented 911 call from a crime that was never solved. It is the sound of every message that was ever lost in transmission. The ghost frequency case taught us that the silence is not silent at all. It is simply a language we are only now beginning to understand, a vast, spectral ocean teeming with unheard voices. The world is full of forgotten frequencies, each one a potential tomb for a story that has been silenced. We are surrounded by a symphony of ghosts, their final words echoing in the digital graveyards we have built and then abandoned. Frank Miller's voice was found by a young man who was simply curious enough to explore the quiet places, to listen to the static when everyone else was focused on the broadcast. His story is a powerful, haunting testament to a simple, profound truth. The dead do speak. The only question that remains is, who is listening?